Good morning. Thanks for being with us. As you know, last night there was a recommendation brought to the Board of Education to close 6 schools as we look for to make budget reductions for the 24-25 school year. These recommendations are pending final BOE approval on March 4th. Those schools are Clark, Cleveland, Park, and Payne Elementary Schools, and Hadley and Jardine Middle Schools. There were many factors that were considered as we looked at which buildings to consider for closure. Those include building FCI scores, the Facility Conditions Index, utilization rate, declining or small enrollment, and much more. And as you heard from the presentation last night by Susan Willis, we looked at all sorts of factors, including classroom size, square footage, secured entrances, shared gyms and cafeterias, et cetera, et cetera. Closing schools solve some of our immediate needs, including filling vacancies, reducing our maintenance backlog, and better utilizing our remaining buildings. With this recommendation, no staff member will lose employment. Our desire is to put people before places. Now I want to focus on the timeline moving forward. Today, this morning, we met with staff of the schools recommended for closure to provide support and answer any questions that they had. We had members of our human resource staff provide them with information on how they can find great opportunities in our district for next year. We also have support for our families who will be impacted from this proposed change. We have specific information that will be shared with impacted families regarding their new school assignment next week on February 19th. Our Parent Support Center is open weekdays from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. to answer questions and to provide support as we go through the process. Parents can call 316-368-8008 or email transform24@usd259.net. We have staff available at the schools recommended for closure to provide emotional supports for students and families. We will have parent listening sessions on February 21st, 22nd, and 26th in different areas of Wichita to allow parents and students a chance to get information and to help shape implementation and outcomes related to the school closings. These meetings are still in planning stages and more information will be released later. We extended our elementary and middle school magnet application deadline until March 22nd to allow families an opportunity to apply for magnet schools and go through the lottery process if they choose to do so. The Board of Education will have a public hearing on the school closures on February 29th at 6 p.m. That will be here at the Alvin Morris Administrative Center. There are many options over the next few weeks to provide support for our families and allow them to provide feedback to us. At this time, I would like to invite BOE President Stan Reeser to say a few words, and then we'll answer some questions. Stan?
Thank you, Kelly. Stan Reeser, Wichita Board of Education President. I just wanted to say that talking about school closing is very difficult. It's a process that started in 2018 that was interrupted by the pandemic and COVID. The Board of Education directed staff to come up with a proposal, which they presented to the board last night. It was clear that it was important that the board try to keep an open mind and to keep all factors in mind. Some of them were very clear, such as the FCA score, capacity, that type of thing. But there's also a very wide variety of intangibles that also had to be considered, such as square footage of classrooms and things like that. I appreciate the messages I've received this morning. I think our public is already understanding that in order to be innovative for the future and to help our students get to the finish line of graduation and to be future ready, that sometimes these tough decisions are have to be made. It's our goal as a board to listen to our families and our staff, and I want to repeat what Superintendent Bielefeld just said about the public hearing on the 29th, which will give the people an opportunity and encourage them to attend listening sessions as well. Thank you. Kelly?
All right. At this time, Stan and I are here for any questions that you might have.
Some criticism from the teachers union and others yesterday about the fact that 5 of these 6 schools slated for closure have free reduced rates above 90%. They're particularly economically disadvantaged. What do you have to say about that? What's your response?
Overall as a district, we're at about 80% poverty. So 90% isn't that much further than 80%. We pulled some data this morning on some of the schools, ranking them. We have 94 school buildings. So ranking them from highest level of poverty to lowest level of poverty. And this data is from December, a Title I report, a federal report that we have to provide. Our building, Park Elementary is number 3. So Park Elementary is one of our highest poverty schools as far as ranking goes. The rest of the schools are 21, 22, 54, 45, and 29. So it isn't as though we picked the 5 poorest schools in the district. We really were strategic. We went for least disruption to the system, trying to find places for both students and staff to be able to go, having capacity in the other schools around them. So when you hear a stat like 5 out of 6 or 90% or higher, that seems startling, but 71 of our sites, 71 schools in the district are at 60% or higher. 81 sites are 50% or higher when it comes to our poverty rate. And coupled with that, at an elementary level, 15% mobility rate, at a middle school level, 20% mobility rate. That data travels with the students. So as those students go from school to school, those numbers fluctuate up and down. So in no way did we target or intend to, close buildings in high poverty areas. But we did look at enrollment declines. That was one of our factors we've been talking about. And so in some neighborhoods, it ebbs and flows as far as, housing goes and the age of the people living in the housing, if they have kids or not. So enrollment declines are part of what we tracked. And I think I'll leave it at that. So does that answer your question?
As far as tracking enrollment declines go, are we looking at just recent enrollment declines, or are you looking kind of throughout the years kind of to see which ones are ebb and flow and which ones are more kind of a holding steady, either increasing or decreasing?
A little bit of both. Susan's charts that she shares, I believe, go to 16, 17. Is that so? 16, 17 has kind of been our base year for all of these enrollment numbers, and that's what we go off of when we look for those trends. Obviously, we lost 2,600 students during COVID, and that was kind of across the board, mostly at elementary, but all of our system took some enrollment decline there. But we see in some of these buildings that we chose for closure, 15 to 20 to 25% enrollment decline since 16, 17, which has been pretty significant. So,
what do your projections look like for the next 10 years or so as far as enrollment? I think something was said last night as far as it's not necessarily looking like it's going to come back up.
Yeah, the chart that was shared last night, I think, went another 2 or 3 years out with gradual declines. Yeah, we don't see any projections of enrollment increases in the future. Some of that's birth rate. Some of that's, population of Kansas overall declining. And some of that is, other choices that families are making as far as their educational opportunities go. But overall, the projections don't show us, falling off an enrollment cliff anytime soon. But at the same time, a steady decline. Since COVID, we've been down, I think, 0.6% a year on average. So it's not as though, we're just kids are fleeing or, we're losing a bunch of enrollment. But we're also not, in a situation where we're at 63,000 capacity with 47,000 kids. If we're not seeing any growth on the horizon, it kind of reinforces the decisions we're making that we need a smaller footprint, quit spreading our resources so thin. So.
And with that continuing decline, how long do you think it'll be before you have to revisit and make more adjustments?
Well, the master planning process will bring forward to the board in May more adjustments, May or June, whenever it comes. So what those adjustments look like is part of what we're gathering the feedback on from the survey we gave over the last few weeks. We'll have some, community focus groups that will further provide and inform that vision for what that looks like. But yeah, there will be more changes on the horizon.
What's on the table for that?
Well, if you've watched the December board meeting, that cooperative strategies kind of laid out what they're looking at, and really looking at our entire district. And this is part of the data conversation. We have questions about what data factors that were used. The master planning looks at acreage of a site, total square footage of a building, FCI score, utilization, square footage of classroom space, ideal classroom space, really just the whole gamut of all of our facilities. And they'll come up with a plan that will be presented to the board, and then the board will decide kind of what they want to do with that, if they want to take the whole thing, take bits and pieces, have different options, et cetera. So
Wichita as a community has been used for generations, has been used to these small neighborhood schools, lots of them, and they're at every corner. Is that just simply not efficient anymore? Is this a cultural shift for the community to think about consolidation?
Well, so part of the decision we're making now is to solve a short-term budget, issue for next year and a staffing issue, to put people before places. So we asked Cooperative Strategies, our consultants, if they supported kind of the direction we're heading now. But really, the bigger master plan will answer that question. Is this something that the community values, or do we value other things more? And it's about priorities, right? It's not that I don't think any of us don't value that, but are there other priorities that might exceed that model? And the reality is, in certain neighborhoods of our community, there's not as many kids as there was 40 years ago. So that creates challenges for us to become efficient, to maintain efficiencies, and then to provide a equitable access to educational opportunities for every kid. When we have smaller schools, we divide up staff and we share them between buildings and all of that. And a lot of times that's not the best model for the student in the long run.
You mentioned last night that there are going to be some students affected by boundary changes who are actually at schools that are closing. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
You mean not at schools that are closing?
Yes, sorry.
Is that okay? Yeah. So there will be. I can't speak to specifics right now, but there will be. I don't even know if we have a number of kids. You have a ballpark?
There's 4 or 5.
Okay.
4 or 5 that will be impacted.
Okay. So, a handful of kids that will be impacted because we had to, and I think it's middle school?
Yes, middle school and 1 elementary.
Okay. So middle school and 1 elementary.
4 or 5 schools.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Not 4 or 5 students?
Yes,
Okay.
sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So 4 or 5 schools that will have a secondary boundary change. We will grandfather those or allow those students to be grandfathered in. So if you're currently going to the school and you want to stay at that school, we'll allow them to remain there. But that boundary change will, over time, then try to balance out, population between the buildings. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
I know it's early in the process, but what potentially could this look like transportation-wise for students? Kids on bus longer, kids on bus shorter. What are we kind of thinking?
Boy, I don't know that we have a good. I don't know that we have a good feel for that right now. Yeah, our estimate. I do know this. Our estimates right now don't show any cost increase for transportation. It should be budget neutral. So.
That was another thing that was mentioned last night, was kids walking longer to school. And a lot of these, again, economically disadvantaged kids might not have access to transportation from their parents. Is that a concern of yours?
Yes. I think, the board has policies that they have enacted over the years to accommodate kids that, have special circumstances or hazardous ways to school or those sorts of things. But the reality is we already have a lot of kids that have to walk 2 miles to get to school currently. So it is a concern. The more spread out the schools are, the longer kids, do have to walk if they have to do that. But it is part of part of the factors, part of the decisions that moving forward. Did you want to speak to that at all?
I was just going to say, one of the advantages of living in the same area of town for the 40 years that I have is that I've seen the change in the neighborhood of less school children and more parents dropping off as opposed to students being bused in or students walking to school. So that trend has already started. And it's one of those things where we will have to take almost a case-by-case basis on if there's any additional hardship that we didn't anticipate.
Anything else?
I know it's listed on this handout, but can you just kind of expand on the options parents who will possibly be affected have, and also how they can get involved in the process to feel like their voices are being heard and contribute to the conversation?
Perfect. Yes, I'm so glad you asked. For parents, the kind of the one-stop shop for their options is going to be our Transform 24 website. So USD259.net. .org, /transform 24. This listed on the sheet there. To give you the kind of the Cliff Notes version, they'll have the option to just go to their neighborhood school if that's what parents prefer. So if that's kind of the easiest option, they don't really need to do anything. They can apply for a magnet if they are in a current magnet, or even if they're not, they can apply for a magnet opportunity for their student. Current students in magnets will get priority. Wendy, what's the term? Priority placement. Thank you, Susan. Priority placement for magnets. And then we also have a special transfer process for the consolidated schools or the closing schools that doesn't come with transportation, but a parent can put in a special transfer for any school building. And you asked a second part of the question. I don't remember what it was.
Just how can parents get involved in the process?
Yeah. So the listening sessions that we'll have next week, we'll be sending those out to parents that are an opportunity for really a two-way conversation with district staff and with people in the building. What does this mean for my student? When will I know for sure what's going to happen? All of those sorts of things. And then the kind of the formal process is the hearing that will be on the 29th at 6 p.m. Where we'll have any voice heard that wants to be heard. The board will listen to all of that feedback and then make a decision on March 4th about what to do with the proposal.
I want to talk a little bit about timing. I know it was mentioned yesterday we have to get these decisions finalized by spring break to implement closures. So there's really no substituting one school for another. It's an up vote, down vote on these 6 schools. And I guess I'm curious, I know budgetary projections can change quickly, but was this $42 million shortfall brought before the board at the first meeting after it was identified by staff? Could this have been brought forward earlier? Did BOE elections factor into that at all? I guess I'm just curious about some of the timing of this being brought forward. It seems it's happening very quickly.
Yeah. Yes. And Susan referenced that in the slides last night. The quick timeline is one of the cons, right? So I'll kind of answer that, and then I'd like Stan to speak to it too, as far as the kind of the history of it. But I think Susan's been pretty clear that we were eyes wide open on the decision to take the $20 million of ESSER money and use it to support the budget, right? I think the board at the time knew that was the right move. We needed to invest in staff. We needed to stabilize the system because of all the impacts of COVID. But we also knew that when June of 24 rolled around, we were going to have decisions that needed to be made. So we started FCI conversations. We started the demographic projections, last spring. FCI conversations happened last summer. The actual $42 million number was around, I think, October, November when we knew for sure. But we knew the range. We knew that we were going to be headed into this. And have some decisions to make. And as Stan referenced, it's these conversations about, right sizing and what we need to do as a district, started in 2018, pre-COVID, for the footprint we have and some of those decisions. So although it feels like it's all of a sudden, really there's been a lot of conversation going on for a while. So you want to speak to that?
I would just add that, first off, let me back up just a little bit on the choice. When I was looking at the school closing that we went through in the 1980s and future years after that, there was very little choice. And that was one thing that the Board of Education directed the staff to look at, is to create a system that was far more fluid and far more available for all students and staff, as opposed to what we've done and when we've had to make adjustments in the past. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, yes, we were interrupted in this process with the pandemic and COVID. And the thought at the time was, if we were experiencing learning loss with the COVID, and if we tried to address attendance center building closings at that time, that we would just be piling on to the crisis that we were already facing. So we knew this future was coming, and we made a choice to delay that decision. But now is the future, and we want to make sure that we can address the future concerns that this district has on declining enrollment. We are a landlocked school district with only 2 growth areas, and so we will continue to do what's best for our students in that area.
So I remember that you guys had said that like that loss of COVID funding and bringing on new staff was like a big factor in this. You were already worried about this before COVID. So did COVID make things worse? Did it make the situation more urgent?
Well, COVID allowed us to delay this decision to close buildings. So we had funds available, historic one-time federal money that allowed us to not have to make this decision to balance the budget. So it was the right decision. Closing a school should be our last option. You know what I mean? It really should. This is so hard for families, so hard for staff. We don't want to do it willy-nilly, and we want to try to exhaust everything else we can do if that's what, if we can. But I think in a lot of logical ways, if you lose 8% of your student enrollment, you can draw a logical conclusion that you don't need as many buildings to be as efficient as you were before you had that number of students. So,
I guess could you speak just a little bit to how much input you had for people who feel like, okay, there's public hearing, there's listening sessions, but the schools have already been recommended. And you're saying this has been a long process. You've known this was coming for a while. And if people feel like it's maybe just lip service, could you speak to what community input went into these recommendations on the front end?
Yeah. And there's a slide from last night. I think most of you probably have the presentation, but Susan references all of the feedback that we've gained. Now, we did not ask, the feedback we did not ask for is, Matthew, do you want your school closed? Yes or no? Right. We didn't ask that question. We said, what are your priorities? And we heard staff, mental health, parent engagement support, paras, that buildings loud and clear, and parents and community said, we value our teachers, we value our staff. That's what we want to keep. So we took that feedback and we put people over places, right? We made that prioritization based on the feedback that we heard. It's not an ideal, situation, because all the options at this point have their challenges. If we were to say, well, we want to maintain all 94 school buildings, then we look at staff and we have to make hard decisions about staff. That's not what the feedback told us to do. Right. That's not what listening to the budget circles from site councils, from schools, the ESSER. We have an ESSER community group that met twice a year all throughout our ESSER funding, that advised and gave input. We surveyed parents, the superintendent search, the strategic planning process. We have a ton of feedback, and it really all points to the same place that I personally believe in too, that our people are our most valuable asset, and that's where we need to continue to invest. We invested in a 2-year contract for staff with essentially a 5% raise this year and next year. And if you go around, the suburban districts and ask them about their negotiations, most of them won't tell you a similar story of success. That commitment for us into our staff is based on feedback. We made that decision based on community feedback. Moving forward, we do want to hear from parents, and ultimately, in January, the board asked us for a recommendation. In February, we came back with a recommendation. Now the board gets to decide, what do they want to do with that recommendation. We just know, having worked in a school and been a principal for 13 years, we're already pushing up against kind of some of the deadlines for planning for next year. So if we get into April and after spring break, it becomes very, very hard to make good decisions for the next school year with staff placements and students and logistics and all that. So that's part of why we've said spring break's our deadline for a decision. But the board has options. They can say we don't want to do this, which then we go back to the table and come up with a plan for staff reductions. So.
And that transition was important for our staff and our students that kind of established this timeline. Is we needed, the board directed the staff to make sure that this transition would be as smooth as possible for our students and our staff. And once you decide that to correct the budget, that you have to place people over buildings, it doesn't happen overnight, and so you need a little time to make that transition. And so it was very important to the board that we try to make this as smooth as possible for our students, their family, and staff.
I know earlier we were talking about poverty rates not being a factor when you were choosing schools to close. I was wondering, was enrollment the main factor behind choosing to close those schools? Were they the ones with the most declines in enrollment or the lowest enrollment?
Our two guiding principles were pretty straightforward. We were trying to get to a $16 million goal for reductions, and we were trying to be least disruptive to the system as possible. So $16 million reduction and least disruption as possible. So as we used numerous factors. We used FCI score utilization, enrollment trends, as you said, overall enrollment, square footage of classroom size, secured entrances, and others. But as we did that analysis, we always had to look through the lens of what is the ultimate cost savings for this decision. So if school A ends up going away and the students go to schools B, C, and D, what does that save us? Because in some circumstances, in some areas of town, we are already at capacity in buildings B, C, and D. So we didn't have rooms to put those kids in, which means the next solution is, adjust those students' boundaries and create a ripple effect. We really didn't want to redo all the boundaries across the district. We wanted to be as least disruptive to the system as we could. So we vetted numerous schools as we went through the process to see which combination of schools between 4 to 7, which was the board direction, could get us to that $16 million budget reduction while also not creating a huge disruption to the system, which is part of why some magnet schools were part of the conversation, because the magnet schools become least disruptive to the system because we're not redoing boundaries with a magnet school. Those students, many of them get on a bus and ride a bus to a magnet, so they can have that same opportunity at a different place if they choose it.
I guess when you were looking at the physical condition of buildings, were there any surprises along the way, or any kind of things that you're looking at building that you realize, hey, that's kind of a ticking time bomb and would be exponentially more expensive if we keep this building in place and then have to make those repairs or maintenance in later years?
Yeah, I do think so. That is a consideration of kind of FCI score is based on the deferred maintenance of the building, so it doesn't capture things like things like a secured entrance, the playground, those sorts of things. And it doesn't it doesn't also forecast needed repairs in the future that go beyond deferred maintenance. So that was a consideration. As I mentioned, multiple data points. That was one of the data points that I would want to go on record that we found no ticking time bombs to speak of. But there's things that we are forecasting, like, oh, that sewer line or whatever, something like that. That parking lot isn't great. Things like that do factor in. And Susan shared some of that data as far as projected cost for some of our buildings if we were to have to, continue to maintain them. So
with enrollment loss, parents also have the opportunity to request a special transfer to another district. Is this district worried about losing those students to other districts or even homeschooling or private schools?
So the special transfer listed on the sheet is to one of our schools, not outside the district. We hope every student chooses us, right? We hope every family chooses us. That's our vision as a district, is to be the premier district of choice. So we want people to choose us. Is that a concern? Yes, in all kinds of situations of transition, people start looking at options. We have the same concern for our staff. We hope that we can keep all of our staff with us, but people will be looking at their options, and we'll do everything we can. As Stan said, we want this to be as smooth as possible and with lots of options for staff and parents. So that's kind of our guiding principle for how we handle it. Thank you guys for coming today. I appreciate you.